Welcome to SpringLaw's Spring Forward Legal Updates webinar series. This series is designed to provide a comprehensive legal overview of key issues related to employment law and human rights in Ontario. SpringLaw is a virtual employment law firm advising on workplace legal issues for employers, employees, freelancers, and executives from a wide range of industries. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and find it useful and informative. To reach our team, please visit us at springlaw.ca. And now to our presenters.
Welcome to our Spring Forward Legal Updates monthly webinar series. Today is the 8th of our 2021 monthly webinars, and today we're discussing dealing with harassment, bullying, and sexual violence in the workplace. We have a large number of people attending our webinar today. Thank you so much. I just wanted to mention we're going to try and save our questions until the end. We have some good information we'd like to get through, and so we welcome your questions at the end of the presentation. And of course, we at SpringLaw are always here to field any questions even after this presentation. So thank you very much for joining. We're really looking forward to this, and off we go.
So my name is Emily Siwa. I'm one of the lawyers at SpringLaw, and joining me today is Flo Vineberg. And if you're one of our clients, you already know that we are labor, employment, and contracts lawyers, as well as workplace investigators at a virtual law firm based out of Ontario. And welcome to those of you who are new to our webinars. Feel free to download the slides under the Handouts tab. And finally, for more information about our firm, please visit our website at springlaw.ca. We have a variety of different resources there, including our great award-winning weekly blog posts, publication for COVID-19 information for employers. We also have a link to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, and we have a great subscription program for employers who want a more hands-on approach with more contact with our lawyers. And we also have an ebook for employees who have recently been fired and are looking for a more cost-effective and alternative to in-person legal services.
And so before we begin, I just wanted to briefly introduce the subject, or why we chose this subject, for two reasons, or I guess a few reasons. The first was that it's quite topical. We know that with the advent of the Me Too movement, we've seen a growing awareness of sexual violence and sexual harassment in the workplace. And with that, the legislative changes that become relevant for employers, including the duty to investigate. We're going to be talking a lot today about trauma-informed investigations. And so before we get into the actual content, I just wanted to give a trigger warning to those who are listening that we will be talking about incidents of sexual assault and gender-based violence. And so it's important that you're aware of this. If you're uncomfortable, please feel free to leave the webinar now. But otherwise, we're looking forward to beginning. And so because we're lawyers, we have this legal disclaimer here. As much fun as it would be for me to read every word out to you, I'm not going to, but suffice to say that this webinar should not be construed as any legal advice. We do our best to give you a high-level overview of the case study that we're going to be looking at today at Western University and the broader implications for employers, but feel free to read this legal disclaimer if you have any questions or concerns. So this is the roadmap for our webinar series. Originally, this was just going to be a single webinar discussing what has transpired recently on the Western University campus, covering a number of things, including sexual assault and harassment and the ensuing investigations, but also the regulatory changes for the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities Act, and implications for employers who have and should have sexual assault and harassment policies for their workplace, as well as conducting investigations. But as we dug deeper into the content, we realized that it would actually be an excellent two-part webinar series because of the importance of trauma-informed investigations, and we realized that it might be helpful for a wide array of employers to have a better understanding of what a trauma-informed investigation is, how to conduct one, and also best practices for you to implement in your workplaces. So the second part of the webinar series, just to highlight, we're hoping to have it near the end of November, so please stay tuned. And we look forward to you joining for part 2 as well. It will be a deeper dive. So as we mentioned, we're going to be discussing Western University. There it is, blue skies, green trees, it looks lovely. However, Western University has quite a reputation that my colleague Emily is going to discuss, because what has been transpiring on the campus has actually significantly impacted student safety, and they have a long history and culture of sexual violence and complicity on campus.
Thanks, Flo. So what happened at Western University? Well, in 2018, there were incidents of sexual violence on campus that were documented through a survey that was done on behalf of Ontario's Ministry of Training, Colleges, and Universities. And what this report revealed was that 71.6% of Western University students who were surveyed had experienced sexual harassment on campus within 1 year of the survey. And that was the highest of any Ontario university or college. This is 71.6%. So we fast forward to 2021, and there are allegations of sexual assault beginning at the start of September and running through orientation week. And these allegations surfaced on social media, mainly through TikTok. The university launched its investigation, the police were contacted, and as things unfolded, around the beginning of October, the London police reached out to more than 600 students after there were rumors that circulated online claiming that up to 30 female students were drugged and sexually assaulted in mid-September at a particular residence hall. So this is a Medway Sydenham Hall residence. And it's important to remember that these allegations surfaced via social media rather than through any formal report or complaint under the school's gender-based and sexual violence policy. And in response to all of this, the students at Western University, as well as Queen's University, staged massive walkouts to protest the culture of sexualized and gender-based violence and complicity on the Western campus, and as a show of support for survivors.
So why is this important, and what impact might it have for employers? So we wanted to talk about the background at Western University for a few reasons. The first is that if there's a prevalence of rape culture, in this instance, campus sexual violence, that could be mapped onto the employer context. And it's a good moment for employers to reflect and gauge the extent to which their own workplaces are safe. It's difficult to ask those problems of your own entity or organization. However, we know that toxic workplaces can be created through a variety of ways, including rumors on social media, including two employees who don't get along, or past incidents of sexual assault or sexual harassment allegations. This webinar also discusses bullying, which can be quite nuanced but have a significant impact on employee well-being. So the reflection on the prevalence of rape culture and campus sexual assaults at Western, just to mirror the employment context, is to say it's important to take a step back and look at the culture of your own organization and ask the difficult questions of whether or not you're doing all you can to model and cultivate a safe workplace for your employees. And separate and apart from the conversations around what policies you have in place and the protocols and whether or not they're being followed, and we will discuss those, the creation of a positive and safe work culture is also modeled through management behavior. And we know that the perception of accountability by employers, so being willing to listen to employee allegations and incidents, bolsters an employer's credibility, and it likely in the end leads to a better investigation outcome in their report. So the background and the assessment of workplace culture, and I mentioned on the slide orientation week, the culture is that at Western University, this was a long-standing issue. Emily mentioned back in 2018, nearly 3/4 of the students had experienced some sort of incident like this. The question becomes, why was this occurring, and why was it allowed to occur for so long, in addition to what the school was or was not doing about it? The flip side also, or in acknowledgement of the role of social media, I should say, it's very interesting because in the Western University case study, no formal complaints were lodged. And so if you as an employer have a handbook or a code of conduct that usually contains clauses around the use of social media, it becomes important to ask what you would do if these types of allegations about workplace sexual assault or bullying or harassment occur online and you become aware of them. We know that formal complaints, formal written complaints are not required to trigger an employer's duty to investigate. But if you do become aware of gossip or rumors circulating online, it's good to know that you have sound policies and practices that mirror the changes in legislation and that you have the competence to address those in sound ways. The final point I'll make about this as a reflection of your own workplace is that, you know, the positive use of fielding these types of incidents in appropriate ways can bolster an employer's credibility and reputation online. So we know that people talk, we know that information is transmitted rapidly online through social media. And so if incidences or allegations are handled well, that can also enhance an employer's credibility online. So we're going to discuss the regulatory changes today. So using Western University as a case study again, we wanted to analyze the changes in two ways. The first was Western University's response itself, which we'll discuss now, and then subsequently we'll get into the regulatory amendments. Emily's going to talk more about that. But just in terms of Western's response, this time they responded swiftly to these allegations, and in part that was because there were so many incidences of sexual violence that had surfaced. I believe it was over 30 online that it became impossible for the school not to respond. It was so prevalent on campus and so egregious. And so they did two things. They created a task force on sexual violence and student safety to address the issue of culture. Some felt that this was too little too late, but we believe that it's always good to take steps forward. And if implemented and utilized correctly, hopefully they would help bolster faith in the administration's ability to acknowledge and appropriately respond to these types of incidences. And in turn, this would give students more faith in the process and augment their sense of safety on campus. The second thing they did was they developed an action plan regarding sexual violence. And I just wanted to point this out because we thought it was creative and it was holistic. So instead of adopting a simply punitive measure of identifying respondents after conducting an investigation and holding people responsible through disciplinary or other means, the school developed this action plan that involved training of over 5,000 students who were living in residence. They engaged the student population, hiring them as safety ambassadors in residences, and they also hired the 4 new special constables. So they used this holistic approach based on an analysis of the entire issue, I should say, to empower students to utilize law enforcement, which helps the perception of a sense of safety on campus, but also they implemented widespread training to try and shift Western's culture. So when you map that onto a workplace context, it suffices to say that there are many ways to shift a culture. Training is an excellent way of doing so, in addition to updating your policies and protocols so that you can engage employees and make sure that your workplaces are safe.
Okay, so as Flo mentioned, I will briefly talk about the legislative changes that occurred in response to these events. So what happened was that the government filed an amending regulation which amends the Sexual Violence at Colleges and Universities regulation, and this is made under the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities Act. And this now contains additional protections for students at colleges and universities who disclose or report sexual violence. And this came about as a result of ongoing consultations between the government and the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, the latter which pushed very heavily for these changes. It's important to note that these requirements will come into force on March 1st of 2022, so that's this coming March. So with this new amending regulation, there are 2 major changes. The first is that university and colleges are now required to have sexual violence policies that prohibit any issuing of discipline or sanctions against a student who is found to have violated the college or university's drug and alcohol policies when this kind of violation is disclosed in the course of the student's good faith efforts to report or make a complaint about an incident of sexual violence. And the second major change is that this amending regulation requires that these policies contain a statement that makes clear that college and university staff or investigators shouldn't be asking irrelevant questions. So, for instance, those that are relating to one's past sexual history during an investigation into a report of or a complaint about sexual violence, or whenever the student is trying to access supports for services for sexual violence. And the original regulation already includes several requirements. So, for instance, the college and university must ensure that their sexual violence policies provide students with information about the supports and services that are available at not only the college and university, but also in the community for students who are affected by sexual violence. These policies have to also identify the body, so the specific official or office or department that has to be contacted for the students to receive these supports, or that can be contacted for these supports. And these policies have to also inform students that the institution will appropriately accommodate their needs, and also, once again, identify the individual or body that they can contact for these accommodations. And obviously, the college and university will have to appropriately accommodate the needs of students who are enrolled at the institution who are affected by sexual violence. Also really important as part of the legislation originally is that sexual violence policies have to also inform students that they don't have to report or make a complaint about sexual violence in order to obtain the supports or accommodations for sexual violence. And now I'm going to move on. We're going to move on to some implications for the employer in an employment context. So the recent legislative changes are applicable to universities and colleges. I assume that most of you watching are not HR professionals for colleges and universities, but as a best practice, it's important to take some time to review and update your sexual violence and harassment policies as well in order to reflect these recent changes, regardless of whether or not these changes currently apply to your business or organization. These changes can be mapped onto non-university contexts when it comes to aspects such as fear of reprisal and the steps that an employer will take in order to mitigate this fear. And it may only be a matter of time before similar changes are required of employers outside of the college and university context. Equally as important, good policies can be an integral part of preventing sexual violence and harassment in the workplace, and having a proper investigation into instances of sexual violence and harassment can foster a positive, healthy work environment that will ensure productivity for the business. And there's also an interplay. There can be an interplay between these sorts of policies and the employer's code of conduct. So you want to make sure that these policies and any code of conduct are consistent with each other and don't contradict each other. And as part of employer policies for sexual harassment and violence, you'll want to go through the normal checklist. So identify what conduct is considered to be workplace harassment, including sexual harassment, as well as violence, who to report these incidents to and how to report these incidents to the identified individual or body. And also these policies should identify how the employer will investigate and address incidents or complaints of workplace harassment and violence, and also how the employer will report the result of the investigation to the worker who's alleging the harassment or violence and the alleged harasser or perpetrator. It's important that those who conduct workplace investigations are competent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that now. So on the topic of workplace investigations, just going off of what I was talking about before in terms of policies and protocols and procedures, obviously it's very important to ensure that the policies will comply with applicable legislation such as the Ontario Human Rights Code, the Employment Standards Act, and the Occupational Health and Safety Act. But when it comes to investigations, you want to make sure that as an employer, the investigator who is assigned the task of investigating any incidents of sexual violence or harassment is competent, is fair and neutral, as well as objective. And competency as an employer can also mean recognizing your own shortcomings as an employer and knowing when you should outsource the investigation to an external third-party investigator and understanding what your responsibilities are under the regulation, any applicable regulations and laws. And in the Me Too era, the employers should always ask themselves questions such as, what is our workplace culture? Are you in compliance with legislation such as Bill 132? And that bill amends the Occupational Health and Safety Act to expand the meaning of workplace harassment to include workplace sexual harassment. Questions such as who is investigating? Are you as an employer capable of conducting what we'll talk about more later as a trauma-informed investigation? Why are these questions important? Well, it's good to ensure that you're staying in compliance as an employer and that the steps that you're taking to address any complaints or any issues that come up are that they're relevant, and you want to make sure that reputational concerns are covered in the social media era, because any complaints or allegations of sexual violence and harassment affects not only the employees, but also the employers. And information, whether it's true or false, spreads like wildfire on social media. And I'm sure all of you are aware of that and have come across that, whether in an employment context or a non-employment context. And it's also important to ensure in the course of investigations that employees can feel safe. There are implications around privacy and confidentiality, and it's important to understand what to do with a report, with an investigation report, if someone else is writing it. When it comes to conducting, a trauma-informed workplace investigation, the level of detail is important. Elements such as reprisal, retaliation, those are all things that are very important to consider. It could trickle into very dicey legal territory, so you may want to outsource this sort of investigation to somebody who is experienced and knows how. And SpringLaw, we do these sorts of investigations and are always happy to assist with that.
Okay, so in the brief time that we have left, we're not going to do a deep dive quite yet into what a trauma-informed workplace investigation is, but suffice to say that when we talk about what it is and why it is necessary, I like to think about it sort of twofold. The first are the human reasons for why it's necessary. So number one, it behooves you as an employer to care, hopefully, about the safety and well-being of your employees. I attended another training session recently where in the sort of COVID/post-COVID, hopefully, era, employee safety and health and well-being are listed as first and foremost for employee concerns above compensation or anything else. So the fact that an employer shows that they care about employee safety is important, especially with the growing prevalence of reporting sexual harassment and violence. These are really good opportunities for employers to recognize that the health and safety of their employees is the top priority, and that if you want to ensure a productive and competent and happy workforce, one of the best ways to go about that is to ensure that people know that you're listening and that you possess the will and the competence to conduct these investigations well. So I'll refer to trauma-informed investigations as TII, just for abbreviation's sake, but that's one of the reasons they're necessary now in the modern workplace. The propensity for employee harm and toxic workplace culture, if not implemented, is significant. We've talked a bit about social media and the ways in which cultural issues spread rapidly around a workplace, how they're shared online. And so it's a bit crass to say if you don't nip it in the bud or address things appropriately, the problem grows out of hand. But we've seen that to be true. And if there's a workplace where things like misogyny or violence or sexual sexual innuendo or harassment of any sort as defined in the various legislation is allowed to be pervasive and employers aren't taking the appropriate steps, including conducting a trauma-informed workplace investigation, then it's going to be perceived as a lack of employer will or ability, and it will probably persist. So the human reasons are number one. The organizational or statutory reasons are number two. We talked about this as a best practice and the fact that you have the potential to capitalize on this growing prevalence or need to address sexual harassment and to be recognized as an industry leader by taking these incidences seriously, being aware of the recent changes in amended regulations and updating your policies and procedures accordingly. So we see in the criminal law context that certain lines of questioning are no longer appropriate, including about past sexual history, etc. And now we see these amended regulations adopting the same line of thinking. Emily mentioned briefly that your codes of conduct should mirror these changes in legislation because despite the fact that those occurred in the university context, they are directly applicable to any and all workplaces. Trauma doesn't know any bounds. It happens all over the place. Unfortunately, it's not narrowed to one industry, and so the fact that your policies can mirror the changes makes it gives it credibility. So I wanted to just share two quotes quickly that we thought were good. So what is a trauma-informed workplace investigation, why it's necessary? So how we conduct ourselves in our interactions with all parties to an investigation has a direct impact on the quality of the information received, i.e. finding all the facts, and ultimately the accuracy of the investigation's outcome and suitability of follow-up recommendations. If you as an employer have the priorities to adopt a do no harm approach with your employees, but also to ensure that the investigations you're conducting are based on reliable evidence, appropriate lines of questioning, sound policies, so that the investigation's outcome and the conclusion of that report provides suitable follow-up recommendations. I find this quote was a really good guide. The second one, effectively integrating trauma into an investigation means not only recognizing it, but anticipating it and building a trauma-informed best practice policy and procedure. We included this just to flag that there can be a proactive employer approach so that hopefully a trauma-informed workplace investigation isn't necessary. That includes recognizing issues perhaps before they become formal allegations or allegations that you become aware of, and anticipating any issues as they may arise. So part of having a best practice policy and procedure is also being able to understand how these issues might manifest in your workplace and addressing them preemptively so that a formal investigation hopefully doesn't become necessary. So we talked a bit about the fact that this has now grown into a two-part webinar series, which we're very excited for. So part two, as we mentioned, is coming up on November 17th. And just a brief breakdown. So we're going to, so there's the overview. So the first part is going to be a deep dive into trauma-informed workplace investigations. And again, this is going to be, we could have an entire year-long webinar series on these, but we're going to try and cover sort of the 5-minute neuroscience or atonic functions lessons on trauma, how trauma impacts someone's ability to recall information, and how this might impact perceptions of their credibility, which in turn could influence either positively or negatively on the report conclusions. We're going to be discussing what in fact is a trauma-informed investigation and follow up on why it's important. We've covered that quite a bit today, but we'll reiterate that. And then the role of the trauma-informed workplace investigator themselves. So this is just a brief flag to say that that person is not expected to be a psychologist or a therapist, and empathy or neutrality can easily delve into sympathy, and that is not the role of a trauma-informed workplace investigator, and it's good to know those boundaries. But that person can, if that type of investigation is done correctly, facilitate a positive and constructive search for truth and assist in workplace restoration if those incidences are handled well.
And just as a quick note, we're running up against the time, and we have 1 more minute until 11. So feel free to jump off if you need to. We'll continue with a little bit of flow over past 11. But if you need to hop off, feel free to do so. As part of our part 2 overview, we'll also be discussing solutions for employers. So an important part is recognizing your abilities as an employer, competencies, which I've touched on already, and thinking about the potential trauma and sensitivity of the issue of sexual violence and harassment, and how difficult it is to come forward for those who have experienced sexual harassment and violence, and ways to deal with that as an employer. And we'll also be discussing best practices or multiple steps, some of which we've already touched on, like updating policies and procedures, assessing if you have the competence to do a trauma-informed investigation, and make decisions about your workplace accordingly. And we'll also discuss the pros and cons of a good or even a bad TII. Cons will include things like the potential to re-traumatize the employee or the survivor, as Flo has discussed. Some pros are actually, could be quite good for an organization or a business. So doing a proper investigation that takes into account the trauma of the person who's coming forward could incentivize more employees to come forward if there are issues in the workplace with respect to sexual violence and harassment, and that has the potential to create and maintain a healthy, safe, and a productive workplace.
So just in concluding, we just wanted to share one more quote, which we felt really summed up a positive way to look at a trauma-informed approach. And it says, if the goals of the workplace investigator are, number one, to arrive at the most informed and accurate findings and consequently the most suitable recommendations, and that in order to do so, the investigator must obtain as much information as possible from interviewees. Number two, avoiding re-traumatizing interviewees. And number three, avoid harming and ideally build organizational trust, then having the knowledge and awareness to apply a TIA or trauma-informed approach is a necessity. So if any of those workplace goals resonate with you as an employer, we welcome you to join us for part 2 to better understand what a trauma-informed investigation is, because all of these outcomes are positive both for an employee and for the organization itself. So we do have some takeaways. They're very brief. Stay with us. I know we're a minute over. Yeah, there they are.
Okay. So the first 2 takeaways we have is that, what the Western University case that incentivized us to, or that encouraged us to talk about the subject is that it shows that compliance and competence go hand in hand. It's important to update policies and procedures as well as protocols to mirror the legislative changes that are coming into place.
And the last 2 Emily touched on, but I think these are very important, is that, and they're connected, is to be mindful of your limitations, both as an employer and or as an investigator. So if it's your job to conduct these types of investigations and you don't feel like you understand what trauma is or the impacts it could have on the people involved, or you're an employer who finds themselves responsible for conducting such an investigation and you are nervous about how to do so, it's okay to ask for help. There are other people who are trained and accredited in these areas. We do these as well. And because the potential for harm is significant. And so it's good to be mindful of your limitations. There's no shame in that. And in fact, the outcome for all parties involved will probably be more positive in that recognition. So we wanted to close with that and to just say thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. And that concludes today's Spring Forward Legal Update. We hope that you'll join us for our next webinar on November 17th, which is continuation of today's webinar. We'll delve deeper into trauma-informed investigations. Details and a registration link are posted on our website. And if you have any questions, I don't see any questions right now, but if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact any of the lawyers directly. For more information, you can visit our website, and you can also follow us on social media and sign up for a monthly newsletter to stay up to date. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much.